Presented by Caltech.
So I'm Eleanor Rosenthal. I'm the chair of the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences. And it's my pleasure to participate in the first of the 4 fall 50th anniversary lectures for the division. And when we realized that the division in its modern incarnation was about 50 years, we decided that we would take stock of who we were, where we've been, by asking some of our close friends to come back and tell us a little bit about what they've done, where they've been, and how they see the division sometimes 20 years or 15 years after they've left, sometimes much more recently. And I also have to thank Federico Echenique and Kathy Yurka, who really did the work of organizing this. What's great about it being division chair is you have ideas, and then you dump the work on other people who do it much better than you ever could. So to continue in this dump the work on other people who can do it much better than you ever could, I'm going to ask Cindy Weinstein, professor of English and vice provost, to introduce John Sutherland, who will be our speaker tonight. Cindy?
John has been my friend and mentor for 27 years. Perhaps he hasn't thought of himself as my mentor, but his generosity, along with his sense of humor, has always been a staple of our friendship, whether he was in California or London. I remember him telling me, quote, "Put down your head and do your work," and quote, "If you're on a first-name basis with an editor, don't publish with anyone else." Little mentoring gems that have stayed with me. And of course, anyone who has been in his orbit and has witnessed his passion for literature and writing cannot but want to emulate him and wish that she could only come close to what he has accomplished. Listing his accomplishments would take the entire hour, and so I'll only allude to a handful. In addition to being a Caltech faculty member for almost 10 years, winning 2 teaching awards while he was here, and receiving the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Scholar Award, John was named the Lord Northcliffe Professor of Modern English Literature at University College London. Listing John's publications would take at least another hour, so again, I'll list just a few. One of his more recent books, published this year, is Orwell's Nose. He is known for his puzzle books, Is Heathcliff a Murderer? Who Betrays Elizabeth Bennet? He has edited many novels, from the fiction of H.G. Wells to Robert Louis Stevenson. He wrote a biography of Stephen Spender. He has written books such as Lives of the Novelists, A History of Fiction in 294 Lives, and How to Be Well Read, A Guide to 500 Great Novels and a Handful of Literary Curiosities. And while writing and reading all these books and sharing his love of fiction with the students lucky enough to get into his classes, he wrote a column for The Guardian. But what I really want to share with you are 2 moments that I've had with John. The first is when I interviewed for the job at Caltech, and the second is when I was talking to him about a chapter I was writing on Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. In 1989, I walked into John's office during my on-campus visit to Caltech. I was prepared to talk about my dissertation, literary criticism, American literature more broadly, but I wasn't particularly prepared to talk about Henry James's short story, The Beast in the Jungle. It's a powerful story, and I urge you to read it if you haven't. John asked me if I were to teach it, what would I do? I figured this was one of those trick questions designed to illuminate my weaknesses and test my knowledge of Henry James and who knew what else. And so I did the best I could. John nodded, prodded, asked more questions until finally the interview was over. After I got the job at Caltech and had been here for several months, I remember having coffee with John and talking to him about how clever and out of the blue the question about the beast in the jungle was. I told him how nervous I was when I was talking to him about the story, and I asked him if my approach aligned with his. And then I asked him why he asked me about that story, to which he replied, forgive my bad British accent, I was teaching it that day and wanted some ideas. Vintage John. The second story happened years later, over coffee, of course, when John was listening attentively, as he always does, to me going on and on about this chapter I was writing on Uncle Tom's Cabin. I was telling him that I thought Harriet Beecher Stowe was getting unfairly accused by contemporary literary critics for not being enlightened enough on the question of race, and that if only critics had read the novels written in response to Uncle Tom's Cabin, novels written from a Southern point of view, readers would know how enlightened, comparatively speaking, Stowe really was. I started telling John about this pro-slavery book I had read where Tom is a rapscallion and all of the runaway slaves are desperate to be taken back into slavery because, according to the author, being a slave was better than being free. In his beautiful accent, he replied, "The Planter's Northern Bride. Aren't you talking about Cindy?" Now, not many people in the 1850s read that book, let alone in the 2000s, but of course John had. Which leads me to my final point. I think John has read pretty much everything ever written that has been translated into English, and maybe he has some foreign language skills about which I'm unaware. He's very modest. I remember him giving a brown bag seminar while he was a visiting professor at Caltech on Tim LaHaye's The Left Behind series, a series of religious books written about the end times. Obviously, he has read, and in many cases written, about every Victorian novel ever written. And when he was here as a faculty member and then as a visitor, he taught everything from science fiction to the literature of the obscene. We always envied him because so many students enrolled in his classes. And of course, the Victorian novel. The Boy Who Loved Books is the title of John's autobiography, and he has shared that love with everyone he knows and everyone he doesn't. On behalf of the English group, the Humanities faculty, the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences, and Caltech, I want to say how grateful we are to you, John, for sharing that love with us. Please join me in welcoming John, who will be speaking to us today about George Ellery Hale's vision of the humane scientist. Has it survived?
Thank you. Let me just say I would love to meet him. I do thank the Vice Provost, Cindy, and I do thank very sincerely the Executive Officer, the Humanities, Kathy Yerker. I thank the Chairman, of course, who's graciously coming. And I would like also to welcome two members, two descendants of George Ellery Hale, Sam and Sylvia Hale, who've come to be with us this afternoon. It is very much, my remarks will be very much addressed to someone who I think is not all that clearly visible. Talking, of course, about George Ellery Hale. Not in her indispensable book, Millikan School, Judy Goodstein actually sees Millikan as, to some extent, the maker, and I believe he was. But it seems to me that George Ellery Hale incarnated, embodied the idea, which, to some extent, created where we now are. Oh, I'd also, incidentally, just like to insert thanks to Kathy Yerker's assistant, Cindy Elvington. You never notice if things are done well, particularly at the organizational level, and I'm grateful for the efficiency with which she made it easy for me to be here. As Cindy said in her very gracious remarks, I've been here a quarter of a century, more or less. I left in 2009, 10 years full-time, 15 years as a visiting professor. I'm very happy here. I'll say something about other places I've been to later, but in toto, you know, put it all together, add it up, I think I was extremely happy at Caltech, and I don't think I was alone. It seemed to me to be part of what you might call the ethos of Caltech, that it makes people content, because that makes them productive. I've been in departments which have gone sour, and it's like milk that never goes sweet again. And you know, they spend all the time infighting, and you know, the kind of academics can be, despite their big brains, they can be very small-minded in my experience. But anyway, that's by the way. But Caltech, in fact, me was a very happy place. Not least, they were paying me 5 times what I was getting in England, but I'm above such mercenary considerations. Anyway, that's by the way. It's a very open campus. We were talking about this. I was lucky enough to have tea with the Hales before this event, and various other Caltech people. And it is extraordinary how Caltech has no walls, no boundaries, no fences. Of course, that's physical. It's part of the location. But it seems to me part of the atmosphere of the place. Well, intellectually, I'll say more about that later. That it seems to me if Caltech is dedicated to anything, it is knowledge without walls, knowledge without barriers. As I say, I'll move on to that. When I was here, one of the things I used to love doing was walking along the colonnades, the Bestel Mall, it's called, at sunset. Sunset is very, very fast in Southern California. I come from the freezing north in Scotland, where in fact, you know, sort of twilight lasts for hours. Sometimes it seems like the whole of your life, really, and the sun never shines. But here you have to catch it and trap it. It's what I believe photographers call the golden hour. I walk along that lovely sort of colonnade, which has a beautiful, quiet Hispanic rhythm to it. It's lovely, actually. And you walk along it for 80 yards, and then you find yourself then in what is called the Milliken Quad. Millikan himself called it the Oak Quad, for obvious reasons. Get onto that in a minute. Now, if you look carefully, you don't have to look carefully, you just have to walk around it. There are 2 busts. They've gone that beautiful green, which, you know, copper goes, you know, oxidization. But in fact, there's something very, very kind of attractive about that hue. The front, right at the front, at the northern edge of the quad, is a fine bust, very like, in fact, Sam Hale, who's here this evening, a fine bust of George Ellery. It's quite clear what he's doing. He's there in his gown, though in fact he wasn't. He had innumerable honorary doctorates, but in fact he wasn't much of a university man in terms of his own student career. But he's looking where else would he be looking? He's hopping over, going through the court of man, as they call it, hopping over the very, very strange, I always think, sort of auditorium, to, in fact, the great telescope, the Mount Wilson telescope. And behind him, across what's called Milliken Pond, now dry as a bone in deference to the current climatic state of Southern California, is a matching bust of Robert Andrews Millikan. There's a certain kind of symmetry in the design of these 2 objects. But Millikan is so posed that he is looking at what else? He's looking at George Ellery Hale's neck. So there he is, you know, hopping over. And it's interesting that, because as I said earlier, it seems to me that, I mean, these 2 men to some extent are, you know, they are what made Caltech Caltech. But George Ellery Hale, had the ideas, the concepts. he actually saw it as a vision. And Millikan was the maker, the founder, the man with a hammer and anvil, if you like. Wonderful combination. I'm going to carry on talking about this very, very, I think, inspirational corner in Caltech a little bit longer. One of the objects which I was passing through it this evening, sometimes since I've been there, but one of the objects which dominates is the Engelmann Oak. It's claimed to be 400 years old, which I think must be an exaggeration, but nonetheless we'll know very soon because it is now dying. Caltech has announced that it intends to let the tree, this majestic tree, die with dignity. That's a very, very nice Caltech touch, that. You know, woodmen spare that tree. Other places would simply get the chainsaw out and it would be firewood. Now, the tree itself, I don't know if you know Engelmann Oaks, they're very, very sprawling. They go everywhere. They have no organization. That seems to me to be very, very Caltech. Obviously, the tree itself predates America. It goes back to a time when this territory was owned by Gabrielino Indians. And yet, it always represented to me something very important. I'd like to fantasize that the roots go under to what is now the Dabney Hall of the Humanities. That would seem to me to be very satisfying. Because, in fact, the humanities, I mean, science is always up there, you know, going forward, you know, beyond the cutting edge. But the humanities are much more retrospective, much more nostalgic. In fact, Caltech's very fine library is now buried in the lower regions of the Dabney Hall of the humanities. And those books, in fact, are very largely by people who are dead, but who still converse with us. We have conversations with the brilliant minds that composed those works. So there is the Engelmann Oak, and it's dying with dignity. But then dominating, I should say something incidentally, but coming up that Bessel Mall, you're really following the line of San Pasquale, the street which, in fact, picks up on the other side of Caltech. It, in fact, is so named because of the gigantic San Pasquale ranch, which Mexico established in the early 19th century, which was huge. It's 15,000 acres. It went to what's now South Pasadena to the west, to San Marino to the east, to Altadena to the north, Alhambra to the south. It was vast tranche of land. On cessation, when Mexico yielded its property rights after military defeat, it became the contest between two people, between Manuel Garcias, who, as the name suggests, was Hispanic, Mexican, and Ben Wilson. And if you go to San Pasquale, you see San Pasquale goes across, it's buried, you walk, it's subterranean as you go across Caltech. And then the Wilson line comes straight through it. There's a kind of conflict there. Anyway, to go back to the quad, it's dominated by a skyscraper, by a large building, a rather beautiful building, I would think. But nonetheless, when I first came to Caltech, there were current among people who worked and sort of came by. There were kind of lots of jokes about it. It was rather looked down. It was regarded as perhaps sort of out of place, an eyesore even. I don't think it was. If you read it carefully, I think it makes what I find a very interesting declaration. Now, of course, part of those jokes were that if you went inside it, I think if you still went, it was a library when I first came in 83 with an administration level on the ground floor. If you went inside, it was quite astonishing because on every floor there were these beautifully marbled lavatories. And I was told, the donor liked to feel comfortable when he came to visit. I'm not sure if that was true or not, but the fact was there wasn't much room, because in fact it had a wonderful elevator system, but in fact there wasn't a lot of space around the elevators for things to happen. But as I say, there were lots of people who you rather kind of disregarded it as anything of great interest or architectural importance. I think, in fact, there is a connection with George Ellery Hale via Robert Milliken, in whose honor the building is named, which is important. Now, George Ellery Hale was born in 1868 in Chicago. There's a very, very intimate connection. I'll say more about it later. A very intimate connection between Chicago and Caltech. Milliken, in fact, spent 13 years, but a long time at Chicago before he came to Caltech in 1913, I believe. But Chicago, 4 years after George Ellery Hale's birth, was devastated by one of the worst urban fires in American history, razed to the ground. A lot of the construction then was wood. This must have been a traumatic experience for the 4-year-old child. Now, Chicago reacted in a characteristically American and defiant way. Let me, by way of comparison, say what happened in London after the Great Fire, when in fact, of course, the city, the capital was rebuilt. But in London, it was decreed that you could have no building higher than St. Paul's Cathedral. That high-rise was, in fact, illegal. And this went on until the 1960s, when, after which the prohibition was lifted, there was an explosion of some of the most ugly skyscraper that you can imagine. But Chicago was very different. What did Chicago do when it was burned to the ground? It invented the skyscraper. Invented these vast buildings, going to the skies, reaching up, refusing to be beaten down by a mere fiery element. Hale's father, one of the things about skyscrapers is that obviously you can build them, but how in fact you use them, you need elevators. The most famous Chicagoan, of course, was Elisha Otis. The first skyscraper is usually reckoned to be in Chicago, the Home Buildings, the Home Insurance Building, which was raised in 1885. But what was interesting was that Hale's father went into hydraulic elevators. He was interested, like Otis, in creating these, what I see, symbolically American things. Now that, I think, feeds through into what you could call, the kind of ideology of George Ellery Hale. It was the first step to the stars. Was to become a very eminent solar astronomer. It's interesting because I want to say quite a lot about Caltech and Chicago. There's a kind of very, very, I think, mutually enriching relationship between the two institutes of higher education, between, in fact, Caltech and the University of Chicago. Now, I don't see the Millikan high-rise building as an eyesore. I see it as a statement, and an important one. And it's over the pond, which has that rather lovely kinetic work of modern art by George Baker, Waterworks, which is now Waterless Works. There's another part of this little complex I'd just like to dwell on. Incidentally, well, by the way, if you, in fact, it is still hydrated, but if you go there, this beautiful little natural garden which miniaturizes canyons, mountains, tumbling streams, little lakes, and so on. It's a beautiful, in fact, vignette version of the San Gabriel's, I suppose, the nearest range that we have here. It's very lovely. And when I was working in Dabney, I used to like to go down and look at students. Students, in fact, here use a word which I've only ever heard at Caltech, and that is decompress. It's a very interesting word because if you know anything about Caltech, you know that the Milliken and Hale version of what science should be was that it should be almost nuclear. It should be compressed right the way down into communities, which were small communities, which would create big science, unlike the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Very interesting. Anyway, talking about students, they would go there, and they would look at the denizens of the pond which is down there, and they're turtles. It might be terrapins. I don't know exactly. And I was looking at them this evening. They come out and they sit on rocks, and they do nothing. And to some extent, they've got a sense of time. What's that joke? Sort of a turtle is attacked by two snails, and he's asked to give details to the police, and he says, "I don't know. It all happened so fast." You look at these turtles, and they are beautiful. They're just absorbing stuff. There was a student there, in fact, rather like an interesting, typical Caltech student. Of course, they dress wonderfully well. And he was standing there. He's looking at it, and he was just standing there looking at these things. And you did feel a certain kind of peaceful. I know I'm sounding rather like a salesman for Caltech, but you felt it. I felt it very strongly. I remember once actually asking a student. Caltech students are very mischievous, by the way, famously prankish. But I remember once asking a Caltech student to write an essay on Moby Dick, the arse she blows and all that, and he came up with an essay on the crayfish in this little pond. I was rather charmed by it. Apparently there are crayfish in there as well. I don't know if there still are. I didn't see any today. There are one or two koi carp, but they keep on getting eaten by the herons. And there are frogs, but the frogs seem to be rather elusive. But you see these turtles there. As I say, it seems to me to express something that in that square, no more, I would guess, than 500 feet of Caltech, it seems to me that a lot of Caltech is inscribed. It is there. Very meaningful to me. I really love it. It's a place, particularly I was just talking, it's a place to go and have green thoughts, if you like, as the poet calls them. Now, in my years here, I made friends with many people across disciplines, which was unusual because it's not something which has been a pattern with me in other places where I've worked. But latterly, at the turn of the 80s and 90s, politically very interesting years, I became very friendly with Hal Zirin, a distinguished solar astronomist, rather like Hale, of course, who is also into solar astronomy. The sun is very, very strange, and Hal was immensely eloquent on the subject. It's there, it's very close to us, it's our life giver, but we cannot look at it. Because if we look at it, we go blind. It's very, very paradoxical. Of course, he was like Hale himself, he was very, very inventive as regards spectroscopy. Devices, oblique devices, which enable us, or enable people who are very, very kind of clever, to look at the sun and work out the sun itself is paradox. And he said, Hal would say, there's certain things about how you can't understand how the corona is hotter and other things, and various things like I didn't understand him, but I was fascinated. Now, he was also very interesting to me because, in my subject, it's containable. English, we can actually put it in a box and say, that's what English studies is. Start with Beowulf, end with whoever won the last Nobel Prize. Astronomers are fascinating to me because the more they know, the more ignorant they are. Every time they get better or more far-seeing machinery, apparatus, they know less because there's so much that they discover that it exceeds the possibility of not merely describing it or mapping it, but making sense of it. It was much easier for Copernicus. Hal was very interesting on things like this. Towards the end of his life, when I knew him, he was to some extent disabled by asthma, as I am, which is why I just had a glass of water, which in his case, I think, was from a pretty heavy cigarette habit in his earlier years and working for so long at high altitude in Big Bear in his beloved solar telescope. And yet, he was a very grumpy man. With good reason. He'd been turned down for jobs at a number of key points in his life because his father had been a member of the Communist Party. Hal, in fact, you couldn't imagine someone more capitalist than Hal. He took his pension, put it in the stock market and made a fortune. But he would moan, I don't want to offend anyone, but he said, I can't understand my colleagues, he said. They keep on saying they want to go to the rim of the universe and look God in the face, and they will not look at the star, which is a mere 92 million miles away. It was very funny. We sit on that bench, which is dedicated to Sloman, looking at the water feature whenever it exploded into watery life. Wonder what the hell it was. And it was very interesting, but it was a real friendship to me, and it meant something because what do I know about astronomy? And to be honest, Hal wasn't all that up in literature. His wife, Mary, was. She was an extremely good Russianist, and I learned a lot from Mary about Dostoevsky. She taught Caltech as well, on and off over the years. Anyway, all this again is apropos, and it seems to me that a lot, and particularly the propinquity of Dabney Hall of the Humanities, a lot can be learned from simply walking through Caltech with an open mind. Now, when I was asked in years gone by what I was doing, people in humanities will agree there's a very frequent experience. You go to a party or something, people say, what do you do? And you say, I teach at Caltech, and they assume you're a nuclear physicist. And I used to say, well, I teach Jane Austen to rocket scientists. I got a cheap laugh. But it was rather true, and it was also true, I think, to the spirit of George Ellery Hale. Now, the lives of Hale, easily acquired. There's a not too bad Wikipedia entry on him. And of course, Judy Goodstein has very full sort of characterization of him in her book. But, just to flesh out a few facts, he was born in 1868, same year as Millikan, actually. And he died in the year I was born, in 1938. Now, I've said something about his father, who's a remarkable man, talking to Sam Hale about that earlier today. But his mother was an important influence on George Ellery Hale. She was a graduate of the Hartford Female Seminary. And she picked up not just a love of literature, but a knowledge and a practice of intelligent reading, which she passed on to her son, George. There are records, apparently, he began, as we all do, with fairy stories, Grimm's tales, moved on at a quite young age to things like Don Quixote. But he was, as the twig is bent, so the tree is shaped. he had a love of literature. And more importantly, I think through his mother, a reverence for the importance of literature. Now, of course, his primary work in life was science. But his interest in literature took sometimes some rather strange forms. When the first light of Mount Wilson was done, you know, isn't that a lovely phrase, first light, fiat lux, let there be light? He didn't just have scientists up there, he had a poet. And the poet's name, famous in his time, was an Englishman called Arthur Noyes. And he's famous now for one poem only, the Highwayman. The Highwayman kept writing. It's a very onomatopoeic poem. But Noyes was brought across, and it pleased Hale, because in fact he also had the very eminent scientist called Noyes, the chemist, in fact, who, you know, so he had two noises off when in fact the telescope opened its great lens to the heavens. Noyes, the poet, was inspired. We are talking now the 1920s, period of literary modernism. He decided to write not just a poem, but a 3-volume work about this telescope. It's called, the first volume is called Watchers in the Skies. I'll see if I can find it. This is how it opens, the observatory. At noon, upon the mountain's purple height, above the pine woods and the clouds, it shone, no larger than the small white dome of shell left by the fledgling wren when wings are born. By night it joined the company of heaven, and with its constant light became a star. A needle point of light, minute, remote, it sent a subtler message through the abyss. It goes on for 3 volumes. Now, as I say, he's a joke now. Unfortunately, he was much revered in his time. And he's still on the national curriculum for British school children, by the way. But it was very interesting that it was important to Hale, and to a lesser extent to Millikan. In fact, Millikan's a very practical man. He, you know, sort of, Forest Lawn came up and said, we'd like to put you. He said, okay, you have my body, I don't care, I'll be dead, just give me money. And Noyes, however, for Hale, represented a conjunction. I mean, the poet Noyes, as opposed to the chemist Noyes. I find that, again, you know, very revealing about the man. Now, how then do we get to what we're now celebrating the 50th year of, the division of the humanities and the social sciences? It was Susan Davis who always insisted we should put the present participle in. Susan, incidentally, I would just like to mention in passing, was one of the people who helped make the Dabney Hall of the Humanities the beautiful kind of building and that it is. I mean, anyway, how do we find latched on to this extraordinary, eminent, preeminent scientific institution? How do we find latched on a division of humanities? It's very telling for me because before I came to Caltech, I worked in 2 institutions. One of which, the first of which, was the University of Edinburgh. Hello. And the University of Edinburgh is very interesting because it is the oldest department of literature, English literature in the world. 300 years old, in fact. The Department of Rhetoric and Belles Lettres was an 18th century Enlightenment innovation. And it still had that ancient departmental structure. I then moved to University College London, which was begun in 1828. A very interesting institution. It was begun because, in fact, clever people who weren't Anglicans and prepared to sign the 39 Articles of the Anglican faith were excluded from Oxford and Cambridge. But UCL was open to all denominations, Methodists, Jews, people, in fact, who otherwise met sort of barriers. It also introduced women 100 years before Caltech got around to thinking it was a good idea in the 1870s. And I loved, it was a very practical place. It had no ceremony whatsoever. It thought gowns and any kind of, the common room was abysmal. It was like a pig trough for human beings. But that was making a point. It did not want all that kind of clutter, all that ceremonial sort of clutter which one associates with Oxford and Cambridge. I came from both these institutions and enjoyed them both. But what was distinctive about them was that they were departmental. Now, the idea of the department, the notion of learning, advancing itself, clustered around a core, a disciplinary core, goes right the way back to the classical trivium. And like the trivium, where does it lead? Well, ultimately, it can lead to triviality. It is true that one of the things you always have to look out for, they're like little citadels, they have portcullises, moats, and you don't talk to historians, you don't talk to philosophers if you're in literature. It is very introverted. And one of the things you have to beware in this environment is, the fact is you just actually lose a sense of anything larger. It is, in fact, molecular in some ways. When I came to Caltech, I was astonished by the division. Now, it's a very badly named label for things like mathematics and astronomy and chemistry and so on, because it doesn't divide, it does just the opposite. It believes in conjoining, it believes in flux, it believes in things coming together, mixing, mingling. And of course, they're very necessary in science, biochemistry, applied mathematics, astrophysics, which was Hale's specialism. It's very, very interesting, the divisional structure. And it's very Ellery Hale, because where was it originated but the University of Chicago? And so you get this kind of, again, this hybridity between Chicago and Caltech. But this, in fact, we're talking now about the ways in which knowledge is advanced, and knowledge is, to some extent, enshrined and preserved, and at the same time evolved. For me, I was very used to the departmental structure. I knew how to operate it. It was a game in which I knew all the rules, knew what you had to do, knew sort of how to, as it were, sort of play that game. The division is very different, though. And when I came, I had a conversation with a senior member of the current division of humanities and social science, a subdivision. And she said that when I knew her, she was working on something that seemed literary, and she said no, she'd moved across to film. I remember Robbie Vogt, who was a vice provost here, saying the great thing about Caltech, which goes together with this divisional structure, the kind of freedom, the liberation from a departmental architecture. He was saying the great thing about Caltech, it was like someone came up and threw a bag of gold over your wall and said, do what you like with it. And it is a very, very productive idea to do that, to liberate human mind. But I found I could never quite work out, I could never actually fix, as that process in photography when in fact you sort of reify the picture before it keeps going and evolving and changing until eventually darkness. I was always at a bit of a loss. I mean, there were people, in fact, in the division when I was there, were very kind of elusive. He's now retired, so I can mention him, but Robert Rosenthal, I could never work out whether he was a novelist, whether he was a historian, but he was a historian who thought, in fact, that history was fiction, and it was all a great novel. And it was this kind of flickering sort of, people weren't labelled and canned. And my closest friend in the division when I was here was a comparatist, still is. Now, comparative literature is something which is completely alien to the British traditions that I came from. Britain is whatever the opposite, well, it's insular, like Podsnap, not English. You know, in fact, it doesn't really believe you can learn anything if you're studying the English novel by looking at even the French novel, let alone a Russian novel. But it's very different. But the great thing about, and it's very, very difficult. I'm humbled by in fact what I'm talking about, because to be a really good comparatist, you have to know so much. You have to know several languages. At the same time, you have to have a huge depth. You have to go right the way back, to the classics. In fact, it is a very, very hard road to furrow. But it's very, very Caltech. I mean, that kind of fluidity, it seems to me, is the essence of Caltech. I can never quite do it myself. I tried very hard. I got a lot out of conversations of that kind. I want to say something, though, very briefly about George Ellery Hale and the next, what I see as great service which he performed for my subject. Henry E. Huntington, had been enriched through family connections. His uncle Collis was one of the kind of railway barons attacked by Frank Norris in the Octopus. Although, in fact, of course, communication was necessary for America. But Henry was associated with another form of transport, the trolley system, the Big Red. But he had a lot of money, and he settled in the West Coast. And he collected books. He loved books. In a very strange way, because I spent a lot of time working in the Huntington Library, which is just down the road. And he collected quite sort of indiscriminately. He loved, for instance, a novelist that very few people read now, Harrison Ainsworth. He would find a quiet nook and read, I don't know, Jack Sheppard or The Tower of London. One of Harrison Ainsworth's once famous, now no longer read books. But he had these, and he was advised by very, very good agent, or two agents, the Rosenbach brothers, on the acquisition of books, and by Devine on the acquisition of art. Martin Ridge, who was one of the great bridge figures between Caltech and the Huntington, used to tell the story that on his deathbed, apparently sort of Henry Huntington looked up and saw Devine on one side and Rosenbach on the other and said, Christ between the thieves. Which seems a little bit hard, really, on these men, in fact, who are eminently respectable people that got some damn good bargains from, particularly after the First World War, when the whole of Europe was up for sale, but particularly great libraries. And on the 3rd of October, 1906, a date which I think should be celebrated at the Huntington, Henry Huntington turned to Hale and said, he said he didn't know what kind of bequest he should make with the already magnificent collections he had of British art and books, principally British books, and said that he was thinking of, because he was a New York man by origin, he was thinking of sending them back to the East Coast, where in fact they would rival the collections of Frick and Morgan, the other magnates who'd turned their wealth into philanthropic monuments to themselves. And Hale said no. And he was very good at separating rich men from their money. One of the but he did it very diplomatically. He must have done, and he always did it with a high motive, I think. And he said, "Well, no, you must leave it here for the people, not just the scholars, not just, as it were, the kind of tourists. Just leave it here for the people of California." Nothing happened for 6 years. Meanwhile, Hale worked on, that may be a crude way of putting it, he kept a very close connection with Henry's wife, Arabella, a very formidable woman. Eventually, sort of, Huntington swung round to agreeing that in fact the best place for it, and it was growing phenomenally at the time. He was buying books by the truckload. Not just rare items, folios, incunabula. No, he's really actually collecting sort of huge sort of quantities of books and archiving them, accessioning them in San Marino. And 6 years later, and indeed it took many years after that, there happened the Huntington Library. It is now, in fact, one of the premier research institutions for my subject, English, in the world. Very generous, too. I first came to the Huntington and stayed in the Athenaeum in 1973. And they gave me a scholarship. It's the first time anyone had done that for me. They gave me lots of money to come across and work. It was beautiful. I got a whole book out of the 3 months which they gave me there. I used to sit in my room in the Athenaeum with paste, putting together cutouts. And they had silent typewriters at that time in the Huntington. And of course, a lot of their stuff they didn't know they had. Now it's all beautifully archived and catalogued. But anyway, that kind of connection is very vital. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why, in fact, Hale believed that a humane scientist was something worth creating. You didn't just need pointy-headed people who could do one thing. You need people, in fact, who had, as it were, an outreach of mind. And that is why, in fact, he persuaded Huntington to root his library here, which has been so fertile for the area in which I'm now standing. I would like to finish, if you'll forgive me, I see it's 5:54, I won't keep you too long, on a personal note. It is, I think, relevant. In June this year, a colleague whom I think many of the people in the division, particularly the humanities side of the division, will remember, died, Alison Winter. She was only 50 years old. She was trained in Chicago. She came to Caltech, stayed here from 1994 to 2001. They went back to Chicago with her husband, Adrian Johns. Died at a tragically young age. I learned so much from Alison. To be with Alison was to be in the presence of a vibrant person. In fact, who seemed to know, she studied the philosophy of science at Chicago, and I was a Victorianist. She was interested in the 19th century as well. She wrote a very classic book she's fascinated by mind. She wrote a classic book called Mesmerized about hypnosis, and then wrote a second book on memory. But when you were with her, it was it was infectious. I mean, she had this kind of brilliance, and she was as interested. I did courses with her I did one course on Victorian science fiction with her. The students loved her, and I loved her too. And she seemed to me to embody, to incarnate that kind of intellectual life force, which was very real for me at Caltech. You just think it's so cruel I gather she was doing very well at Chicago. She would do well anywhere. I mean, if you put her in San Quentin, you know, she would have been a force for good. As I say, I would like, you know, sort of to, if what I've said has any value at all, to dedicate what I've said to Alison Winter, and I think Kathy will be making the cut your throat sign quite soon. So I thank you very, very much for coming, for listening to me, and long live humanities at Caltech. May it have a 1000th year anniversary. 3 Engelmann Oaks, if you want to put it that way. Thank you very much.